Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Annual Racial Violence Hub Workshop, Feminist Approaches to Theorizing Genocidal Violence, Wars, and Occupations. My name is Shireen Razak, and I'm the Distinguished Professor and Penny Canner Endowed Chair in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. This event is being managed by Sarah Montoya, doctoral candidate in gender studies, who we thank for her diligent management of the hub. The Racial Violence Hub is a virtual community of feminist critical race scholars working on issues of racial violence and the state. The hub is directed by myself under the auspices of the Canner Chair. The hub's goal is to foster research, develop critical pedagogies, and share resources for anti-violence practices around state violence against Indigenous and racialized peoples. The hub emphasizes the race line that runs through state violence and terror. Please go to our website, racialviolencehub.com, to find out more and also to access recordings of the sessions. The series on genocidal force has the goal of bringing together conversations across diverse contexts, from North America to Asia, Palestine, India, the Middle East, Turkey, Armenia, and others. We began the series in October of 2021 with an opening lecture by Professor Laura Kang, Categorical Violence and Innumerable Loss, Traffic in Asian Women. We continued in November on the racial politics of settler state genocide in Palestine, and in December on genocide management, carceral reformism, policing, sexual violence, and the role of law in North America. In January, we turned to the context of Assam and India and had a session on imaginaries of dissent. Today, we turn to the historical context of the Armenian genocide, the first in a two-part workshop with a presentation by Dr. Melissa Bilal. Dr. Bilal's presentation takes the series in the direction of how to theorize feminist intellectual voices in relation to the genocidal colonial structures and feminist silences in Turkey today. Before I introduce Dr. Bilal, I will just remind you that the series continues on February 25th, slight departure from our usual once a month, with a presentation by Dr. Ruken Sengal on the same context of Turkey. Dr. Sengal will discuss how political analysts often depoliticize gender and sexual violence that permeated the topography of the Armenian genocide, doing so by the way of the racialization of Kurds. So now to our speaker, Dr. Melissa Bilal. Melissa Bilal is a distinguished research fellow at UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies and a lecturer in the Department of Ethnomusicology. Dr. Bilal comes from the American University of Armenia, where she is an assistant professor in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her recent publications include Lullabies and the Memory of Pain, Armenian Women's Remembrance of the Past in Turkey, an article that reads Armenian women's lullabies and narratives of the past as reserves of an affective memory, and discusses their potential to critique the neoliberal memory politics in Turkey. She has a forthcoming publication, Voice Imprints, Recordings of Russian Armenian POWs in German Camps 1916 to 1918, a CD project that aims to bring the Armenian experience in relation to musicology's colonial history into public audibility. In 2017, Dr. Bilal launched the annual Feminist Armenian Studies Workshop and founded the Feminist Armenian Research Collective with a colleague. Both are co-editors of the book A Cry for Justice, 5 Armenian feminist writers from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey, 1862 to 1933. The commentator today is my colleague, Professor Zeynep Korkman of the Department of Gender Studies here at UCLA. Her teaching and research interests include transnational feminisms, cultural politics, gender, labor and affect, and religion, secularism and the public sphere, with a regional focus on Turkey and the larger Middle East. Her primary scholarly agenda is to explore how gender and sexual minorities survive, resist, and even thrive within neoconservative and neoliberal encroachment upon their life worlds. We're looking forward with great excitement to her book, which will be out within the next year, tentatively entitled Gendered Fortunes, Feelings, Publics, and Labors of Divination in Post-Secular Turkey. So please put your questions and comments in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will begin with Dr. Bilal's talk, which is entitled Stories of Dreadful Inequities and Unutterable Suffering, Theorizing Arshaguhi's Teotig's Indigenous Feminist Voice in relation to mass violence against Ottoman Armenians. Apologies for butchering that name. So let's begin.
Thank you very much, Shirin, Zeynep, and Sarah, for organizing this workshop and inviting me to this very important platform where I can share my work outside my comfort zone of Ottoman Armenian studies, but I'm in maybe a more comfortable zone among feminists and my good old feminist comrade and friend Zeynep, and really think together about violence against indigenous and racialized people across the globe. So, and across time, I guess. So please give me a moment to set up the screen. And yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
And you hear me well? All right. Today, I will talk about Armenian feminist writer, journalist, educator, and activist Arshaguhi Teotig. I will specifically focus on her monograph, Amismo Igiligya, Gıtskudur Noter, A Month in Cilicia, Patched Up Notes. This book, published in 1910, was one of the earliest testimonies to the aftermath of the 1909 massacres, pogroms or massacres against the Armenians in Cilicia. Cilicia is a region which Armenians inhabited historically. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire then and is now Southeast Turkey. And I wanted to share this map for those who are not in Armenian studies or don't know enough about the geography, the politics of the geography a little bit. It's a very simplified map. I'm not discuss about borders, but it will give you an idea of what I'm talking about, where Turkey is, where Armenia is, where Armenians have been living historically, historic Armenia and Cilicia. So this paper draws on research I have been conducting for a collaborative project titled Feminism in Armenian, A History in Documents, with my colleague Lerna Ekmekcioglu of MIT. It is a book and digital humanities project that aims to recover the history of Armenian feminism in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman contexts. Arshaguhi Teotig is one of the feminist writer activists I'm writing a chapter on for this book, which will come out in 2023, hopefully, from Stanford University Press. And let me note that all quotes I will read today are Jeffrey Michael Goshkaryan's Armenian to English translations for our book. Before everything else, I would like to start this paper by providing you with a short contextual background. In the second half of the 19th century, Armenian women living within the borders of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman Empire began publicly vocalizing their demands for freedom. These demands and the strategies they developed to achieve these demands were inspired by and formed in dialogue with women's emancipation movements in other parts of the world. And they were reading the publications feminists produced mainly, but not only in French. This first wave Armenian feminism was also shaped as a response to the democratization and secularization attempts within the Armenian community of the Ottoman Empire and the rising political consciousness among the learned urban bourgeoisie about injustices Armenians faced as a community. I'm simplifying a very complex and dynamic picture here, but I believe this gives a general idea about and helps me better contextualize my argument for the purpose of this workshop. This was also a period of socio-political and economic transformations in the Ottoman Empire, where women from different ethno-religious communities began objecting gender injustice. Armenian and Greek women were the first in the empire to start feminist publications and women's organizations. Armenian feminists of the 19th and early 20th centuries also took the lead in shaping the gender politics of their own community and the Armenian modernity. They made essential interventions in the emerging public discourses on enlightenment and progress within their community and beyond. Their sphere of influence also reached to the Armenians living within the borders of Russian Empire and Persian Empire of the time. Why do we call these women feminist foremothers when some of them didn't even call themselves feminists? Because they questioned and attacked gender inequality. They identified the power dynamics and structural injustices that functioned on the axis of sexual difference. They interrogated the concept of morality, critiqued Armenian patriarchal norms, and defined a new understanding of progressive morality and ethics, progressive for their times. They were feminists because they took it upon themselves to call women to unite to fight against male domination and oppression. They edited and wrote for women's journals, published literary works and essays, delivered public speeches to advance their cause. They established and chaired organizations, worked as educators, opened and directed girls' schools and orphanages. I say orphanages, which is very important for what I will discuss today. These orphanages were mainly for the children survivors of mass atrocities against Armenians. Armenian feminists we study in this book not only actively worked in the enormous effort of collecting orphans, they also were among the first to extend a helping hand to all survivors by immediately mobilizing their feminist organizations' existing networks and infrastructures. As relief activists or as members or sympathizers of Armenian revolutionary parties, or as intellectuals formulating the relationship between Armenian women's emancipation and the Armenian people's emancipation and national and communal rights, they created a rich body of literature that theorizes the condition of being an Armenian in the Ottoman Empire from a feminist perspective. Quote, "The more I wandered through memories of the past, the more I admired the people who knew how to heroically defend themselves, their families, and the lives of thousands of the Armenian inhabitants of neighboring villages, who knew how to fight without losing heart and by putting up a staunch resistance for 14 days to remain undefeated. And what, if not this, did the natives of Dirtyol do? They defended themselves. It is undeniable that the first law of every body politic is to defend itself. This is the plainest decree of the great lawmakers," unquote. Wrote Arshagui Teotik in Mountain Cilicia. On April 15th, 1909, Armenian residents of Dirtyol, a town in Cilicia, received the news that Armenian farm workers in the outskirts of their town were killed by a mob. A wounded survivor who escaped the raid informed them that the pogrom in the Armenian quarter of Adana, the nearby city center, which broke the previous day, was now spreading to the surrounding areas, and the Armenians of Dört should be prepared to counter a possible attack against them. Dört Çorkmarzvan or Çokmarzvan in the Cebeli Bereket County of the Adana province of the Ottoman Empire was a prosperous Mediterranean town surrounded by orange orchards and with approximately 5,000 inhabitants. They immediately held meetings, formed committees, and began organizing their self-defense, İkna Başbanutun in Armenian. Women and men, old and young, including children, worked together to build walls that made their orchard fences higher and thicker and connected them to one another. They dug trenches and blocked all the roads into the city. Dört now looked like a guarded fortress with volunteers taking turns and posts watching for the approaching danger. For the next 2 weeks, Armenians of Dört, joined by the villagers of neighboring villages, successfully defended themselves against 7,000 to 10,000 men, armed men, mobilized by the county governor, Mutasarrıf, who sieged the city, fired from multiple points, and cut the water supply to the town. As I said in the beginning of my talk, Arshagui Theotics Amisma Igiligya, published in 1910, was one of the earliest accounts on Dört resistance. And for us feminist historians, it is a document that sheds light onto her political view, on views on political violence, collective resistance, and the concept of justice, even before the genocide happened, genocide of 1915 happened. Who was Arshagui Theotik? Arshagui Cezvecihan Theotik was born in the Balat district of Constantinople, Istanbul, today's Istanbul, the Ottoman capital, in 1875, and received her elementary education in local Armenian community schools. At a young age, she read Sırpuhi Düsap's novels, and as an aspiring writer, she paid a visit to this legendary Armenian feminist author and activist salon. As an exceptional case for a woman of her generation, Arshagui continued her education in England and France, coming from a well-to-do family. Her writing career began while she still a student and continued throughout her life, contributing to major Armenian periodicals of her time, including feminist journals edited by another feminist, Hayganush Mark. And on this slide, you see a piece that Arshagui wrote for Mark's Zagrik journal, feminist journal, sharing her memories of being an international boarding student from the Ottoman Empire in England, which in and of itself is very unique. Arshagui married Theotos Lapchinjian in 1903 and adopted his childhood nickname and pen name Theotik. Hence, her last name became Arshagui Theotik as her unofficial family and pen name. Theotik couple were a productive team and soon began publishing their famous Amenun Daretütü, Almanac for All, yearbooks, and penning other majestic historical and linguistic studies together. Husband Theotik made a deliberate effort to assure his readers that Arshagui, who chose not to use her name, was actually the founder of the Almanac and the co-author of the volumes that came out under his name. On this slide, you see a letter Arshagui wrote to Russian Armenian feminist poet, socialist poet, Shushanik Guruginyan, on behalf of the Almanac's editors. And in a number of letters back and forth that we found in the archives, Arshagui informs Shushanik about the Armenian women writers in the Ottoman Empire and asks her to send her own photos and poems to be printed in the Almanac, basically bridging between Armenian feminists across imperial borders. Like many Armenian feminists of her time, Arshagui was a school teacher. She was also a writer of a textbook on modern ethics. And if we have time, I can talk about how this ethics book connects to her discussion of justice, why she wanted to write an ethics book. Her service to education also took the form of activism when she joined Askanover Hayuhyats Engerutyun, Patriotic Armenian Women's Society, an association founded in 1879 by Isabella Sadur with the purpose of opening girls' schools for Armenian communities in the Ottoman provinces. Askanaver was banned and its schools were shut down with the escalating authoritarianism of Sultan Abdülhamit II and the massacres against Armenians. And in 1908, a few months after the restoration of the Ottoman constitutional regime and the end of political repression, the society was reconstituted. So the massacres of 1909 happened after the reconstitution of the constitutional regime and the lifting of political repression. That's why it's unexpected and huge. So when in April 1909, the news of the atrocities in Cilicia arrived in Istanbul, the members of this newly reopened Askanaver decided to allocate their resources to help Armenians in this region. While preparations for a benefit event, because technically their budget was empty because they were shut down during the repression, while preparations for a benefit event were still going on, Arshagui Teotik, as the Secretary General of the society, came up with an unprecedented and courageous decision. She was not going to wait until the funds were raised, and she was against the idea of just sending money to the survivors. So if you remember the map, they are miles away from the massacre region. This is southeast, what is southeast Turkey today, and they are in Istanbul in the northwest. And before they were sending money, and basically they were not actually going to the regions when they were opening schools. Arshagui was going to the Charti Ashkar, Zulumi Yergir, in her words, meaning the massacre land. She was warned against traveling alone as an Armenian woman to the heart of a conflict zone and with very little money. But this petite and soft-spoken, but extraordinarily sharp and daring woman had already secured a free ticket from the ferry company. Leaving her 4-year-old son to his father's care, in October 1909, she embarked on a ship towards the Mediterranean coast. Quote, an oppressive calm reigns now, the death-like calm that follows fierce storms. These were the first impressions when she landed in Mersin, where many Armenians had found refuge, surviving the nearby towns hit by the massacres. The next day, she was going to reach Adana and see, quote, a prosperous city transformed into a boundless pile of ruins, inhuman neighborhoods with no houses, the Armenian population reduced to a bare handful with faces made monstrous by terrors and distress, unquote. And she will be told that what she was witnessing was nothing compared to what they have survived before she arrived. Arshagui had arrived in the region approximately 5 months after the catastrophe hit that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and destroyed the Armenian social and economic life in the city of Adana, the surrounding towns within the larger Adana province and part of Aleppo province, mainly the county of Alexandretta. Estimate is 25,000 victims, but the number was probably higher because it was a cotton picking season. Many seasonal farm workers registered in other provinces were also present, and they were killed. Arshagui stayed in the region for about a month and worked on the ground to help relief workers in tending wounded and traumatized children, raped women, and all survivors in need of medical care, out in the streets without food and shelter against the approaching winter and an unexpected flood disaster that happened while she was there. Arshagui Teotik's giant work in Adana was to collect the orphans and bring them under one roof where they were safe, healthy, and their vital needs were cared for. For the Askanaver school that you see on the slide, where mostly schoolgirls from the orphanage were going to attend, she arranged the building and furnished its rooms, selected a local representative, a principal, teachers, and staff, and left the region, making sure that the classes started and the students were registered. She distributed to them the textbook and school supplies she had brought with her from the Askanaver headquarters in Istanbul. And it is important to note here that as an Askanaver representative and an Ottoman Armenian woman, she also met Cemal Pasha, the then newly appointed governor of Adana, who would later become one of the orchestrators of the Armenian genocide. And she demanded from Cemal Pasha and secured the restoration funds promised by the government in order to spend on desks and chairs for her newly founded school. While in Adana, Arshagui also received a letter informing her that the society took charge of financing and supervising all girls' education in Cilician orphanages. Thus, being in the region, she held meetings to get detailed reports on the newly opened Askanaver schools in different towns, such as Hajin, that she couldn't personally visit. She also traveled to Dörtyol, where the education of girls in the orphanage was now under the society's patronage. And you see a group photo of the students in both schools on the slide. Shortly after her return to Constantinople, Arshagui began publishing her report in the local periodicals, and towards the end of 1910, her monograph came out. It was a volume enhanced with photographic documentation. Quote, "Let us go see the orphans, the surviving remnants of an annihilated population. Others would perhaps say those hopes for the future. There are scarcely 100 of them who, while waiting for a suitable building to be built, are living in a house with a stable in which 45 Armenians had taken refuge the day of the catastrophe. They were discovered, placed on a wooden slab, and slaughtered one by one. Today, I saw that wooden slab," quote, writes Arshagui. A Mountain Cilicia is a first-hand account of the recovery efforts of a local community impacted by mass violence, while still living side by side with the unpunished perpetrators. Organized under dated sections like a log, the text is an autoethnography of an activist who took part in the relief work. In that sense, it also documents an early episode of women's organized efforts' vital role in the survival of the Armenian people. This is crucial because in historiography of Adana massacre in 1909, except for an article by Victoria Rowe, this role that feminists played remained overlooked. In fact, it is essential to grasp this because the Adana massacre was a turning point in the history of Ottoman Armenian feminism, as we argue in the book, where feminist networks and infrastructures had to get mobilized to respond to and to mend the damage caused by state-sponsored or state-backed mass violence against Armenian communities. And shortly after, obviously, a larger mobilization was going to be organized for the survivors of the genocide of 1915-1922. Arshagui Teotik in this text used the terms yerend, meaning crime, as in Medziaren, the great crime that Armenians used for the genocide, but remind you that this is before the genocide, Godorat, carnage, chart, slaughter or massacre, aret, catastrophe, or tepk, events, to refer to the bloodshed hit Cilicia in 1909. She also referred to the victims as a vokhjagez, which literally translates as Holocaust, burnt sacrifice. She wrote, quote, "Was it real? Was it true that I found myself in the land where my race's blood had flowed in streams, where so many crimes and massacres had been perpetrated?" It is remarkable that she uses the word tser, which is the translation of race in Armenian. As I mentioned before, A Mountain Cilicia is a testimony of the aftermath. So in the text, we come across moments where the author tries to visualize what has happened. For example, about Armenians seeking refuge in the German cotton factory, she writes, quote, "How far can one flee real death in that moment of utter savagery, panic, mayhem, and massacre," unquote. As an Armenian urban bourgeois feminist from the capital, Arshagui was encountering with the topography of the violence related to her by the members of a massacre-torn community, basically the survivors. She documented the social, economic, political impacts of violence on these local communities struck by it from the eye and voice of an Armenian woman, and more importantly, a representative of a women's organization whose main target was now facing an existential threat. That eye and voice leads us to a better understanding of the gender experience of the political violence and to a better grasp of the human, the lived experience of the catastrophe as opposed to numbers. Among other reports written around this time or earlier, such as those with the purpose of proving what happened, the purpose of investigation and documentation to be presented to the government or to the Armenian Patriarchate, Arshagui's text purpose was in fact a call to the community, to Armenians in elsewhere outside the massacre zone, to extend a helping hand to Cilicia survivors, something she continued doing even after the publication of her book. She wrote pieces and gave speeches in the following years to raise awareness about the enduring poverty in the region and to raise funds, especially for Askanaver's schooling campaigns. This immediate goal aside, A Month in Cilicia offers a voice of an Ottoman Armenian woman who, very much using the discourse of the discursive space opened up by the 1908 revolution, and its promises of freedom and lifting of repression, raises important questions pertaining to authority, law, and justice. Political violence that sparked in Cilicia the day after March 31st, which was April 13 in new calendar. Those who grew up in Turkey would know the day as March 31st event. It was a counter-revolution attempt by First Army Corps and the supporters of the old regime, and the subsequent brief restoration of the Abdulhamid rule in the Ottoman capital. And it was a major disappointment for Armenians who had welcomed the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 and its promise of equality among Ottoman subjects and liberty of public expression of different ethno-religious and political commitments. One of the major reasons behind this disappointment that Armenians experienced lies the fact that the new government, Young Turks, or the Committee of Union and Progress, which will later orchestrate the genocide, made every effort to put the blame on the supporters of the old regime, Hamidian regime, and to cover up its own role in the massacre. While Armenians had evidence to suspect that the massacres were either ordered from the capital or were fueled by the local CUP representatives who used the chaos created by the struggle between the pro-revolution and pro-old regime power holders, incited the masses to violence by spreading rumors that Armenians were uprising for independence and attacking Muslims, or by recruiting and arming the mobs, or simply by not intervening and protecting Armenian citizens under their governance. As a part of the government's cover-up, the court-martials that were held as a result of the pressure by the Armenian deputies in the Ottoman parliament ended up not punishing or eventually pardoning the main responsible in higher up positions who were complicit in the crime. Of course, there are many more important details I'm missing here because of lack of time and because neither my research nor my paper aims to provide an exhaustive account of what happened in Adana in 1909, but a number of eyewitness accounts and thorough research by scholars such as Raymond Kevorkian and Dros Dermatosyan, among others I referred to in my study, provide us with essential information and insight to have a better grasp of this history. My focus rather is on meaning formation around this experience and how it connects to the political philosophical threads Arshagui Theotic's text. In analyzing her narrative, I paid particular attention to the way expression of emotions guide the reader into an orientation about how to understand this event in relation to her self-perception as an Ottoman Armenian, that is, issues related to her sense of belonging as a subject of Ottoman Empire. In that regard, it provides me with clues to decode the formation of Armenian subjectivity and the centrality of this awareness of vulnerability in the face of legitimized violence against her community. Her contemporaries evaluated Arshagui's monograph as a volume pulsing with emotion and truth, to quote Zabel Asadur as an example. And I contend that as much as it may be and should be read as a strategy to interpolate Armenians into an affected community, that is the Armenian nation, I suggest that we turn a deeper attention to the value of this sentimental literature as a genre of women's political writing. And in the future, I hope literary scholars compare this text with examples of sentimental literature women created for political activism in other parts of the world. And I know that there's a scholarly literature that studies this in relation to the 19th century abolitionist literature in the US. A note here, Armenian feminist women made recurring references to racial injustice in the US of their time and the anti-slavery movement, which we discuss at length in our book in comparison to the entangled history of feminism and abolitionism in Europe and the US, which of course was a complicated one marked with solidarities and betrayals. Arshagui's account testifies to her rage against perpetrators and the authorities that force Armenians to live under the threat of persecution. Her brilliance lies in her noticeable move away from the Christians versus Muslims discourse in an attempt to establish ground for accountability. While raging against committing murder in the name of God, she names and acknowledges both Muslims and Christians who saved hundreds of lives, such as the French Sabatier family or the Baitarzadeh Hassan, and articulates her anger towards the hypocrisy of Christian megapowers, superpowers, who not only did not do anything to stop the violence who were stationed there, but also under disguise of humanitarian aid, humiliated the survivors by entertaining themselves with their misery, such as throwing bread to the survivors from the top of the German factory. Again, a small parenthesis here. This text has an uneasy relation with the discourse of civilization, because while she herself functions within the framework of civilization and sees educated and cultured Armenians more civilized compared to those in Adana who don't even speak Armenian, they speak a vulgar Turkish, and sees her mission as civilizing them, which also means reviving their Armenianness. But she very clearly diagnoses the main problem with the discourse of civilization and condemns the way European missions see Armenians of Adana as lesser human beings and wishes them to, quote, finally admit that they too are people like us, unquote. I said accountability above because she makes it clear that what happened in Adana cannot be reduced to a clash between two religious communities. It was the state and the people in the position of power who needed to be held responsible. As I pointed out, a mountain Cilicia meticulously records down 1, condition of the survivors, 2, her activities on the ground, especially the Askanaver-related work with orphans and education, and 3, finally, the self-defense effort. We can easily assume that this early account of historic resistance is entirely or mostly based on what she heard from the organizers and participants of the resistance themselves. She was not there. Going back to the story, on her way to Dörtyol, Arshagui stopped at the Erzin jail to visit Mihran Der Melkonyan, the young leader of the Dörtyol resistance, who was arrested along with other leaders of the defense. So Armenians were arrested for organizing a self-defense. Mihran Der Melkonyan and the other leaders were later sentenced to death transferred to Adana to be executed, but thanks to negotiations, they were eventually pardoned. But by the time Arshagui is there, she doesn't know that. She visits them in the prison. They are sentenced to death. After hours of fighting with bureaucracy and finally finding herself waiting alone and in fear in a room in the middle of nowhere in a military barrack, Arshagui managed to see Mihran and hand him the small amount of money she was given by a priest in Adana to cover Armenian political prisoners' daily expenses. And when she arrived in Dörtyol, she became the guest of their Melkonian family, his family. And precious details of this visit to their Melkonian family were shared with us during an interview Lernaik Mekçioğlu conducted with Mihran Dermelkonyan's grandniece, Marian Mesrobian McCurdy, who grew up hearing the resistance story from her grandmother, Eliza Saçaklayan. Eliza is Mihran's sister, so they were together resisting. And Eliza Saçaklayan was a participant in the defense, and she printed her memoir in 1965 in Hayrenik Monthly of Boston, and we are very lucky to be able to read it. When Arshagui arrived in the region, the court-martials were held, and in order to settle the situation, some locals guilty of massacres and some innocent parties, including Armenians, were punished. From early on in the month in Cilicia, Arshagui pointed to this injustice, expressing her discontent with a world that did not belong to those who worked hard, but to those who were powerful and cruel. So the big disappointment is to see that people who defended themselves were punished. This disappointment was intensified when she visited the prisoners in Adana who were convicted to 15 years by false accusations, such as provoking people to rebel, firing guns from their houses and killing people. She's talking about Armenians. Although neighboring Greeks and Turks have testified that they were not in their houses at the time, but had already fled. Throughout the text, perhaps more than anything else, Arshagui's discussion of the self-defense presents itself as a point of reference in her conceptualization of what constitutes rights. That's why I want to return back to Dörtyol to conclude my argument about Arshagui's perspective on justice. Quote, the natives of Dörtyol acted in accordance with the law in defending themselves and their own, unquote. Quote. Yet, what had the law done to those people who had rushed to the assistance of their fellows and exercised the natural right to self-defense? It had thrown them into prison, whipped them, and cast them in chains, wrote Arshagui in 1910. And I want to show you a group photo of orphans in Adana. Fast forward to 1915. History has yet to write the experiences of Armenian women whose husbands were arrested, deported, and murdered during the genocide. Arshagui Teotik was one of them, and she paid it with her life. In April 1915, a few days before the roundup of Armenian intellectuals in the Ottoman capital, Arshagui's husband, Teotik, was sentenced by the military court to 1 year imprisonment with the accusation of anti-Ottoman military propaganda in the Almanac. A short while after serving his time and release, the Ottoman authorities deported him. He survived the genocide by being smuggled among Armenian laborers constructing the Taurus Mountain Tunnel for the Baghdad Railway. It was a labor camp during the genocide. Arshagui visited her husband in jail, supported him with money and books, and after his deportation, she spent years worrying for his life. She tried to make a living for herself and her son with the modest income from private lessons. They had to move out of their apartment into a basement floor, which was in poor physical condition during the war years. When husband Teotik returned from exile, Arshagui was suffering from deteriorating health. But it was in these armistice years that she became an active member of the Armenian Women's Association, founded to make women active agents in the post-war, post-genocide campaigns for orphanly relief, collecting abducted and raped women, reviving the communal life, and documenting women's and children's suffering during the war. The right to self-defense she gave so much thought to after Adana was now presenting itself as a possibility of self-determination for Armenians in the Wilsonian world. As many Armenian intellectuals of her time, with the conviction that the international community, if properly informed by the crimes committed against Armenians during the war, would deliver justice, in this case, in the form of territorial sovereignty. In order to shape the public opinion during the Paris Peace Conference on behalf of Askanaver, Arshagui put together the report that you see on the screen, Unpublished Testimonies on Turkish Atrocities Committed in Armenia and the Chronicle of the Armenian Epic in Shevin-Karahisar, again reporting the eyewitness testimonies that she collected from during the genocide and the resistance in Shevin-Karahisar, and made the arrangements. She put that in together in Armenian, and she made the arrangements for its translation into French and publication in Paris in 1920. This report was the last activity of Askanaver, because during the genocide, Askanaver was already dismantled. Its 50 schools, girls' schools in the Ottoman provinces were destroyed. Its students, staff, education board, and parents were deported and murdered. In 1922, Arshagui's tuberculosis worsened, and she had to move to Leysin, the mountain village in Switzerland, known for its TB clinic. The same year, she died there without being able to see her home again. Her funeral was held in Switzerland. But back home in Constantinople, her sister comrades of Hygiene Feminist Journal editorial board organized a memorial church service for her. They all were soon going to witness the burial of any hopes for justice for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was such a rich talk, and I really look forward to hearing how different people will engage. I am really thankful to Sharon Razak for creating this community of Racial Hub, and to Sarah for organizing and facilitating these meetings. So I just want to briefly share comments and maybe kind of suggest a broad question that, you know, we can put aside and see as the conversation develops with the attendance, people attending, if we want to come back to that or not. So I'm going to read my comments today. Arshagui Theotics, A Month in Cilicia, becomes in Sabila's powerful reading an example of feminism in the aftermath of mass violence. Arshagui, a relatively privileged, well-educated urban Armenian woman in early 20th century Ottoman capital of Istanbul, travels to the massacre land, as in her words, devastated by a chain of events that would eventually culminate into a full-fledged genocide, as we know now. Not content in the role expected of her, given her class and gender, which is fundraising, maybe publishing and teaching, but no more, she travels personally to witness and take part in recovery in the aftermath of the grave crimes committed against the Armenians, Christian Armenians in Adana. There, she not only tends to the survivors, mobilizes to help keep safe and educate the orphans and does more, but also, as I was hearing from Melissa's talk, she tends to the physical objects, places, and traces of the massacre. In doing so, she's effectively attuning to not only the survivors, but also the spatial and material remains of this grave crime committed. And not rushing, at least initially, right, to translate this event into a religious / ethno-racial or civilizational encounter and violence, she insists on accountability and justice. including the right to self-defense, which has, of course, broad feminist repercussions in different contexts, from individual violence to communal self-defense. Encountering the aftermath of a mass violence, where survivors remain in the proximity of their attackers and in the proximity of the very state that provides them with impunity, the attackers with impunity, she does nonetheless keeps on investing in recovery, investing in witnessing, and investing in what I would call political hope. As contemporary witnesses to this historical account, we already know what would come next, both for her personally, as we heard it from Melissa Blau, but also for Ottoman Armenians collectively. And this weighs heavily upon any easy optimism we may feel about learning about Arshaugi Teotik's work. But her efforts, I believe, can still inspire feminisms of all kinds in different geographical and historical settings in the aftermath of mass violence. Feminisms persisting in proximity to perpetrators enjoying impunity. Feminisms registering and tending to the affective and social lives of mass violence. I listened to her voice myself as a US-based feminist woman from Turkey with a long silenced Armenian heritage, a heavy heritage that I'm only painfully and only incrementally coming to register and feel with all its weight. A heavy heritage that reveals how my own national, familial, personal affiliations are so tightly bound up with racialized gendered violence in ways, that are challenging to register. And as such, I find Arshaugi Teotik's work inspiring, and not only for Armenian or adjacent feminisms, but also for indigenous feminisms, for Black feminisms, for Middle Eastern feminisms, to put it in US categories at least. With Arshaugi, I am inspired to think of what I'm tempted to call a vulnerable feminism, that cannot rely on simple political truisms, even as it makes political appeals. A feminism tasked with witnessing, understanding, and resisting racialized violence, and defending the right to self-defense against such violence. And a resilient feminism that invests in life and invests in justice despite all odds. I'm hoping that today Melissa will get to further expand on what her feminism and her work might look like, or as we seek inspiration from it, and what is the relevance for contemporary feminisms as in different parts of the world, including US, we are living in different temporalities and specialties of aftermath of mass violence. Thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you, Zeynep. For this very moving and sophisticated comment. So if I were to connect the dots and bring Arshaugi's text in relevance to today, what's going on in Turkey or in the world, two things. And on a theoretical level, two things are important, as you already actually pointed to. So this feeling, the sense of belonging to a group of people, to a community whose lives are constantly subject to legitimized violence against them, is very familiar and basically and very relevant to today's world. The way I came to this reading of Arshaugi's text, obviously I'm reading the text as an Armenian woman who lives in the States in the 21st century, who is informed by the theorization of racialized violence and violence against indigenous communities, in the US context and in the global context, and the history of colonialism and post-colonial struggle and everything, I came to this understanding or this formalization obviously by reading the works of Black feminists. African-American feminist thought is very crucial for my own understanding of myself and this text. So that's why I actually want to go personal a little bit and then go back in time. So basically, because this is the story that I want to, this is a very unique platform for me, because this is the first time Zeynep and I are doing this. And I am talking about a history that shaped, I've always thought that it shaped me as an Armenian woman. I was born and raised in Turkey as an Armenian woman. I was active in the Turkey's women's movement as an Armenian woman, belonging to a community that is now reduced to a couple of 10,000, like I think 50 or 60,000 now, after the genocide and after decades of policies, repressive policies and migration. So basically, Zeynep and I also go back to the kind of 1990s feminism in Turkey and Turkey's feminisms facing basically like white Turkish feminism facing challenges and criticisms, I mean rightful criticisms by Kurdish feminists. And when we were active in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was a new understanding of feminism and difference in Turkey, and that in that space that Kurdish feminists challenging, criticizing, attacking the nationalism and racism of white Turkish understanding of the category of women only as Turkish, middle class, heterosexual, Sunni, Muslim, was challenged by Kurdish women who were actually, and their experiences were very, I mean, similar and different, but the differentiated experiences were actually coming from being subject to state violence and police violence and sexual violence by the authorities that was legitimized and not punished, and all these questions of accountability and coming from a vulnerable place, but coming from also a resistant place, coming from a community that is organized around political consciousness and resistance, which was hard to swallow for some of the Turkish feminists who didn't really reflect on their internalized nationalism under the kind of hiding it behind feminism. So basically, it's in this political space that me and Lerna Ekmekçioğlu, my friend, we got organized as feminists, politicized as feminists in Turkey, and learned a lot from the Kurdish women's struggle and the way they expressed their difference, quote unquote. But at the same time, in college, when Zeynep and I were sitting next to each other in our college classroom, we were also reading Black feminist thought. We were reading Bell Hooks and Patricia Hill Collins and Audre Lorde and also third world feminists that was called back then, and post-colonial feminism, all these like colonial and post-colonial labels. But later, obviously, like this was a dynamic time. I and Lerna, we were reading Bell Hooks and taking notes about how we can apply her theories, her understanding of being racialized, being a minority woman, to our own experiences, because there were some things that were not matching in our experiences, are not matching with what we were hearing outside the community in the feminist movement. So basically our turn to our history and the need to write a feminist history of our own connects to activism, connects to the need that we felt as Armenian feminists. I mean, we were 4 and then 8, we're talking about a number of people, and Zainab knows most of them. So we were trying to bring the feminist discussions that we were having outside the community into the community, and all the problems that Armenian women, the women within the community, women and LGBT back then, obviously, we were also very active in LGBT movement, and to outside the community. I don't want to do this inside out, but there was clear, if you know what I'm talking about, we're talking about community which is after the genocide completely like closed on itself and very protective, very though there's a lot of like democratization in 1990s, there was also democratization movement within the community. We are also the result of that too, that kind of that dialogue between inside and outside the community along feminist terms. So we ourselves went through a process where we couldn't explain what it meant to our feminist sisters, what it meant. And to this day, this is a problem, this is continuing, because Turkey's feminism to this day hasn't faced, hasn't worked through, hasn't admit that had the genocide didn't happen, we would be in a better place in terms of feminism and women's rights. So the story that I'm telling you, it's also the story of story of feminist movement in Turkey. And as much as it affected me, my history as an Armenian woman, it also affected non-Armenians and Zeynep's history, basically, both her Armenian side and non-Armenian part of her family. Because as feminists in Turkey, when we were fighting about female education or access to schooling, we never really knew and thought about the fact that 100 years ago, before the genocide, Armenian women went to the remote villages and founded schools there. And during the genocide, these schools were all destroyed, and the people were killed in it. So that's one thing about, that connects to today. The second thing is basically this discussion of self-defense and the fact that Arshagui Teotik, like some of the women that we study in the book, they openly wrote about what they think justice should look like for Armenians. The most important argument, one of the most important, what makes feminism Armenian, maybe like what is indigenous. We have been reading a lot lately, indigenous feminisms. Is that what is unique and what is difference? It's basically not blood, not essentialized forms of belonging, but this idea, this sense of not being protected by the state, not having lives not mattering, basically. And to this day, this is a problem that we find it hard to communicate with non-Armenian citizens of Turkey sometimes, that like what it feels to come from a community, although you have all sorts of problems within the community, power relations as feminists and as queer activists, but there is something that makes you kind of same with the others in that group, the way your identity is racialized by the power that divides you. So that is a question that is still going on for me. In terms of self-defense and self-determination, basically is very integral to that, because here again you see a feminist woman who is has a very clear idea of what justice is, and people's right to self-defense should be included in justice. And if you're punished for defending yourself, that is not justice, that is not accountability, which is kind of almost our life's history in Turkey, meeting and working with women who basically believed in self-defense, participated in self-defense, and were marginalized marginalized from the legitimate political accepted political resistance, understanding of political resistance. So basically this text makes me think about the forms of resistance from a perspective of an Ottoman Armenian woman, a feminist, who was there, who was an activist, who actually tended the aftermath of mass violence.
I wonder if,
my life story I put out there. So.
Thank you so much, Melissa. There's so much to think about here, including your last point, especially about relations among feminists and the way in which our struggles don't sort of enter our hearts in the same way. So I'm wondering now if we can, if there are questions in the chat, if there's anyone would like to ask questions. And while we're waiting for you to do that, I will just start with one of my own, which I couldn't help thinking as I was listening to this, both your comments, Zainab, and this presentation. I couldn't help thinking about feminist activities in response to the situation in Afghanistan today, for instance. Talking to feminist activists who are desperately working to respond to the the peril that confronts feminists in Afghanistan right now, and thinking about how that has kind of failed to register on everyone's radar, and people seem to have trouble making the distinction between a kind of, bourgeois, let's save the women type of thing, to an actual very concrete, very dangerous, horrific situation in which lots of people, but feminists in particular, are, targeted. And it really, your presentation, I actually, felt a little bit like, wow, what am I doing about this? Or what are we all organizing to do about this? And I think your example is not, I don't want to dismiss that example as, or label it as simply inspiring. It's not that. Here was someone confronting state terror and having to figure out, how to witness, how to do something about it, except at the same time as, how to save the orphans. And it really brought into mind our present situation today with respect, not just to Afghanistan. I'm thinking of Syria, I'm thinking of Yemen, I'm thinking of all of these things happening at once. And what might we consider, or where might we locate a feminist response? I know in Afghanistan, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, for instance, as an organization, has been heroically working, trying everything they could think of to try to literally save women and getting them to safe houses at the same time as they're having to think of state regimes and so on. It really brought it to home. So that came to mind. I don't know if are there any questions from the audience at this point. I suspect people are really doing some heavy thinking about this situation. I don't know if you want to say something briefly about the parallels you see for Afghanistan.
Me or Zainab?
Either.
I want to say something more general, but of course, obviously, I agree with everything you said about Afghanistan and also like other parts of the world, as you said, like Syria and Palestine. And this recurring question, I see it more and more a feminist question, and I think you're very right. We have to think together and find a feminist, like maybe not one answer, but answers to this, because most of the time we talk about feminist sisterhood, but when it comes to there are other considerations that are blurring that kind of solidarity, because feminism obviously isn't not one. It's like century-old political thing, like thought, and has its own philosophical currents and strategies of activism, and kind of works with other ideologies like anti-capitalism or anti-heteronormativity and everything. And this question of where should we stand as feminists, or what is our primary alliance should look like, is a very important one, and also very depressing and heartbreaking one, because I myself, because if you're a feminist, you're basically, your quote unquote god or goddess is the feminist resistance. There's nothing else you believe in. You believe in justice, you believe in solidarity and organized action. That's what you put your faith and hope in it. So what happens is, this is because you have all your struggle within your community, in the country, along different lines. But when it comes to feminism, you always feel like it's with sisters, like it's safe haven. And I'm really thinking about Audre Lorde's speeches and writings here about, are we among sisters? But if your racism is, if you're not seeing me, and if you are reproducing that worst violence against me, then how are we going to be sisters? So the same thing is about the question of Afghanistan, and connecting it to back to history. Zainab was talking about political hope and source of hope, and I've always thought that feminism have always been source of hope for me. My hope was always the organized action of women. And whenever there was something that was happening to my community, maybe like very recently there was a war in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, my hopes were, I first went to my feminist friends, thinking that they have given a lot of thought to this question of racialized and gendered violence. And the disappointments and depression hits there when you don't see that the people who call themselves feminism cannot understand where you are coming from. That, because I think feminism is, I don't want to romanticize, but it is based on a certain ethics and trust. You believe that the person is coming from a progressive or a place of freedom, and is not a racist, or knows that you are not a racist, and believe in peace and anti-militarization. But when you're talking about a group of people who are targeted by a military, or targeted by armed forces, how do you negotiate between your commitment to anti-militarism as feminists, and to be able to, as you said, like protect and collect these people, and basic safety of these people, and what is going there? And as you said, sometimes you hear a lot of bourgeois kind of almost colonial discourse there. So going back to the political hope and source of hope question, which I think connects to today and the Middle East, obviously. So I think in Arshagui's case, because it's a time when right after the revolution and the promises of equality and freedom, because this is before the genocide, she's still as a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, subject of Ottoman Empire. Her source of hope is the Ottoman state. So she's disappointed, and she writes this text. Of course, she calls the Armenians to help other Armenians, but you clearly see that she situates the authority that she legitimately takes, who's gonna deliver justice, is the Ottoman state. She still believes in. She questions. She says the Ottoman law is not protecting Armenians, is not protecting my community, but still there is this kind of belief and hope of belonging to the same country, belonging to the same political entity. And this is a very powerful text, because in 1909, maybe the earliest text in history that criticizes humanitarianism and Western intervention in the Middle East, if you like, in the name of humanitarianism, and seeing that how actually it's a colonial relationship. But at the same time, history proves that in 1915, so that hope, that source of hope that was the Ottoman state for her, basically continued to fail, and it finally went to completely annihilate the whole population, Armenian population. And again in 1920, she's writing this report to be sent to Paris Peace Conference, with the hope that if the international community, now the source of hope is outside, and with the hope that if the international community will be informed, they will help them constitute justice. Because now they are victims of a state that killed its citizens. It's different than what happened in Adana, which was a localized pogrom, which state was implicit, but I mean, they couldn't prove that state, but the genocide, we know that was orchestrated by the state. So now the source of hope is the international community. And fast forward, we see this in we saw it all through, I don't know, late 2000 or early, in Iraq. Since the beginning, Iraq, Rojava, Afghanistan, Syria, and then Artsakh, and we keep on coming to this point of what are we expecting from the international community, and what are the in this today's kind of world where there's no we need to find and to decolonize our feminist mind, so that we can sit together and help each other as feminists, because it looks like nobody else will help or intervene in a conflict without any interest, financial or oil or military gains or but if you believe in freedom, then we need to start hearing each other without questions. And I'm saying this because we write in the book, and Lernek Mekçoğlu has recently written an article about the responses of Turkish women, Turkish upper class, upper middle class women who had access to power during the genocide, and they did nothing to prevent it. And when in Turkey, people ask us, if Armenian women were in solidarity with Turkish women, or was there? So that's a constant question that it comes up, because when we talk about feminism, we talk about solidarity, we assume solidarity. But as we constantly read from the works of minority women, we know that solidarity has a very long way to go to discuss and to trust each other, and to find to basically break the colonial boundaries between us, to be able to hear what's going on the ground, because theoretically everybody is against killing, against militaries, against colonial, everybody is against power, about what happens when you have to defend yourself. And one thing that is really I like about this text is that also my intellectual kind of journey is it's very Fanonian, very early, but that situates, I mean, doesn't glorify just armed struggle, talks about how people themselves were the source of, as Fanon said, the source of violence is not the people who are defending themselves. The source of violence is the violent state, violent, the mobs who were attacking. And when you have to defend yourself, take up arms to defend yourself, you are not, you are a victim. You're still a victim. Because you are militarizing and arming yourself and completely changing your way of being and understanding yourself. And we don't need to talk about the effects of militarization of a society. I have recently witnessed this in during the Artsakh War in Armenia, that in Armenia, feminists were calling for a feminist solidarity for peace and to stop the war, and they were being bombed, shelled. They were questioning, like, where is this anti-military space when your life is under danger, and you are under bombardment. You're still questioning, you're still trying to be self-reflexive, because you're also seeing how militarization and war is affecting women, children, and men, and traumas and everything. But you're also calling out to the international feminist community, but nobody is hearing you, because they think that the place that you are coming from is a nationalist place. That is very, I think there are a lot of parallels in other parts of the world.
So let's hear from Zainab.
Yeah, I just want to jump in as there's really just, I want to catch up on what you were saying on that. You really kind of really well captured the kind of all the dynamics and tensions, and like kind of in feminism, we want to assume solidarity, except, as transnational feminism and feminisms of color have long told us, it's not to be assumed as something to, like continuously build towards and kind of, but I was also hearing what you were just saying is like, like as like the feminist task of, as you're kind of thinking about how to escape this bombardment, and also to critically analyze and reflect on like militarism, right? So, and that's, I think, what I was hearing from Shireen too, in the sense that this kind of now, feminism is now long established and institutionalized as an academic discipline, right? So the kind of the theorizing and criticizing is something that we have come to specialize, and the kind of activism, and even beyond that, kind of what has come to be seen as perhaps like social work or service work or whatever you're going to call it, right, has come to kind of further get distance from what we're doing, like in the academia, right? So then when we're presenting with something like what's happening in Afghanistan, and like we don't know, or we're not moved to, or we go there, or like, I don't know, like collect money, or I mean, not to include everybody in this fee, but at least me and some folks I know, let's say, who identify as feminists in academia, right? But we're like, we know how to like criticize like imperialist discourses about Afghan women. You need that, like this is something I have to offer, but that doesn't quite cut it at all in this moment of like real kind of, very immediate threat to life, right? And very immediate violence where people need to kind of survive and also have their multiple needs met. That doesn't mean that that needs to be, or can be separated from feminist politics or analysis, but it is, right? Also practically. So I guess then the broader question that the work that you introduced to us by Theotic helps to think with, and that we could really use to think with now in this pressing case of Afghanistan is to how to bring those threads back together, how to be able to kind of, engage with the kind of immediacy and urgency and the kind of very like material, like bodily, like existential, threats of the kind of whatever we're going to call humanitarian crisis is a common word we use nowadays of what's happening to everybody, but also especially to women and feminists in particular, right? In Afghanistan, with our kind of now like established ways of talking about Afghanistan and women in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, right? Where our focus has been Western representations of them and how kind of colonially tinted feminisms and, militarists have been circulating those representations to justify, okay, we know that, but also, hey, something is happening here now, like what is our like broader, like how do we expand on our feminist repertoires of analysis, but also, I guess, activist solidarity, and actually like beyond that, right? Beyond that, actually very basic needs of the community, first of all, to be safe.
Well, on that note, I think I will draw the session to a close. This has a lot of food for thought across all these contexts, for Armenia, for Afghanistan, for all these other places. I know, for instance, that many feminist organizations are beginning to wonder whether they can only keep women safe if they talk to the Taliban, which they don't really want to do because that's the problem. But on the other hand, how are you going to get the guns to stop, targeting specific people? So thank you very much, Melissa, for this amazing talk. And we will I suspect that there'll be a lot of thinking going on about it for a while to be able to engage in it. But thank you again. And thank you to Zainab for the comment. Thanks to everyone as well for listening in.